So good morning, everybody. Welcome to this PhD defense candidate. Oh, okay. So the candidate is I think it's not for. Is that for the recorder? Oh, okay. So the name of the candidate is Jesus Arturo Moreno Lopez, who is going to present the thesis entitled An Agent-Based Journey in Social System Research, Motivations and Applications. And it's my pleasure to present the PhD committee. I have the secretary is Elsa Arcaute Aizpuru from UCL, University College of London. I have also the pleasure of Rafael Prieto Curiel from the Complexity Hub in Vienna, right? And myself will act as a chair with Jesus Gomez Gardeñes from the University of Zaragoza. So now the candidate will present the thesis for 45-50 minutes, more or less. Then we will leave some time for the people who wants to leave the room. So if you want to leave the room after the presentation, you will be able after it. And then we will start with the questions. After the questions, I will give the opportunity to any PhD doctor in the room who wants to ask any question. And after all, the public presentation, the public examination will end, and we will going to deliberate along the PhD in order to see which is the score of the thesis. Okay, so we start. The room is yours.
Well, thank you very much. If I can, I will put a timer just so I can know how much I've been speaking. So thank you very much for attending. As said, the title of the thesis is An Agent-Based Journey in Social Systems Research, Motivations and Applications. I'm Jesus Moreno, and under the supervision of Jose Ramas Gonzalo Meloni, I will present the work performed in the thesis. So I would like to start by quoting one of the greats here, at least for our institute, Maxi, who says that complex system science should be understood as a change of scientific paradigm. It's the triumph of emergence over reductionism, not so much defined by subject or specific system research, but as a way to approach the understanding of systems behavior. And this is what I will try to exemplify. So give examples of this philosophy through, in this case, agent-based models. So into the objectives, this thesis aims to show how agent-based models in social systems can be used as tools for understanding complex dynamic, but also as practical instruments for policy. It demonstrates how multi-scale and heterogeneous factors can be integrated into these models, and also how policies can be hypothesized and also tested in silico before actually being deployed. We're going to argue, for example, that agent-based modeling is not only convenient, but essential for some of the 21st century challenges that we have for policymaking. So the outline I'll be covering these 4 chapters. The first one is a game theory chapter that addresses human AI cooperation under some assumptions, then a mobility model for epidemic containment policies, then a network epidemiological model geared towards assessing contact tracing, and then the micromobility model and simulator, which will be the last chapter. So diving straight into this chapter, the motivations is that artificial intelligence is making social settings even more complex. We have already some news outlets warning about the future of AI and reality. And also we see in crescendo feeling of not being able to trust interactions online because AIs are so similar to some of the interactions that we would have with real humans. For example, the new banana models for image generation. So we know that these intelligent systems can be used for disruption in social systems. Scientific American ones. Okay, at least it's me. Scientific American wants how AI bots could sabotage elections. And here we want to propose ways for which they can be used to foster the collective good. So game theory can be understood as, as the mathematical theory of the interaction between self-interested agents. And very important for game theory, something very interesting are social dilemmas. Social dilemmas are when the private aims of the individual conflict with the interests of the collective. This is of high interest because rational agents should lead to no cooperation. So this is something that game theory tries to address. Maybe the most famous example here, which you of course know, is the prisoner's dilemma, in which agents can cooperate or defect. And according to a payoff matrix that defines the rewards from the interaction, if this ordering is satisfied, then you will have a prisoner's dilemma. And this will be the setting that we'll be addressing. So our model proposes a hybrid environment, and we're going to propose two AI protocols. The first one, two kinds of agents. The first agents are AI-like agents, and they have two protocols. So Samaritan, which they always cooperate, they're always trying to be nice, and discriminatory, which they try to punish defectors by also playing defection, but reward cooperators with cooperation. The human-like agents, on the other part, they work through imitation. They're going to observe the payoffs that other agents have, and they're going to weight them according to the payoff difference and the Fermi function, so a sigmoid. And then they're going to decide if they're going to switch strategy. We consider a completely mixed setting because where you play the prisoner's dilemma, because we don't want the effect of structures or network behind. So to do this, let's say we have n human agents and m AI agents. And so at any instant, the system can be characterized by the number of cooperators. You know that at any point there's k people cooperating and the rest will be defecting. And so you can calculate the average payoffs like this, which is just knowing how many people for cooperators will also lead to cooperation. And of course, taking into account the behavior of the AIs. We can also define transition probabilities, which is pick a human and at random, and then see if they can change when they encounter others. And the thing is, once we have these transition probabilities, you can't just run simulations. The stochastic nature of the model will leave you to a fixed point state, which is a homogeneous population. So we have to use what we call here the fixation probability, which is the probability that the single agent with a given strategy A manages to swap all the rest of the population that's playing B, introducing one seed of a strategy and seeing how it spreads. And this allows you to define the frequency of cooperation, which is the ratio between the fixation probabilities, well, normalized with both. And this will tell you the tendency of the system to go towards one of the two sides. So our first results consider where humans treat equally other humans and also AI, so they cannot distinguish if the rewards come from a human or AI. And we also use a specific parameterization of the prisoner's dilemma called the donations game, in which you basically manage the offset and then rescale. So you're only left with two parameters. In this case, one is set to 1. So we see here in this figure for the Samaritans that there's little dependence on parameter B for this boundary, which makes us think that Samaritans AI actually act as a critical mass of role models. At low intensities, the fact that C is strictly dominated is less important because it's weighed less. And so the role modeling effect is stronger. If you increase the intensities of selection, so you go down into this diagram, it's more obvious to human-like agents that they're actually losing if they're cooperating. And so it tips the balance toward defection. You need more role models for them to have cooperation. At the high enough intensity of selection, you get the disappearance of this cooperation region. For discriminatory AIs, it's completely different. We see that at low intensities of selection, they are completely mixed in 50-50. This has to do with how imitation works because humans cannot imitate discriminatory AIs. And what we think that is happening here is that they are working via denial exploitation of payoffs. What is happening is that if you have enough AIs and enough reward, they are able, because they're punishing the defectors, to sway them by saying, hey, if you're defecting, we're not going to give you the reward. Like the others, it would happen in the other case. But of course, without enough reward and without enough AI agents, you have what we expect that it's going to defection. So altogether, we see that at low intensities of selection, it's better to use the Samaritan AI under these assumptions. But as the intensity of selection increases, only the discriminatory will sustain this region. Nice result is that you can derive analytically the red line just by considering which fixation probability dominates. And you will get this relationship, which is exactly what was plotted here, which is a nice analytical result. And then we can also think, well, what if human agents are not considering the same AIs to the other humans, so they're not weighting the payoffs at all? And this manages to sustain a region of cooperation here, which before wasn't observed, but here the results are exactly the same. So we also want to contrast this with the limit of large populations. What we do is that this is the limit of sending n and m to infinity while keeping this fraction constant. And so this leads us to the replicator dynamics, in which the fraction of cooperators, which is this x, evolves like so. It takes into account defectors interacting with human cooperators, with other AIs, but also being able to lose cooperators by interaction with defections and also successful probabilities. So this is quite cumbersome, so I'll just go through the main takeaways here. Samaritan's AIs would take this form. And what is actually interesting is to observe the payoff difference, because when you use the prisoner's dilemma, this will always be negative. And with the donations game, it will be constant. And this explains why we see this vertical boundary, which is not dependent on the other parameters. This would be the final expression. For discriminatory AIs, we can do the same. It's a bit harder to see what would happen in the prisoner's dilemma. But if we go to the donations game, we obtain this expression over here, which tells us when the payoff difference for cooperators is positive or negative. And we get this expression. And the good thing is that this condition and this condition are equivalent in the limit. And if you went into details to examine really the results, and if the concaveness and convexness, you would see that they match in their equivalent results. So as a summary of this chapter, under the assumption of payoff-based imitation, we have proposed Samaritan AI-like agents and discriminatory AI-like agents in the well-mixed prisoner's dilemma game. We have disentangled the effects of these agents on the humans. They can either be role models or they can be work in exploitation reward denial, and this acts differently in different regions of the diagram. And we have checked the results via two methodologies, namely finite size population methods and replicator dynamics. Regarding complexity, we can just see how complexity can emerge solely from nonlinear behavior of agents, even if they're simple and even if the scenario is homogeneous. So let's go into the next chapter, which is mobility modeling for epidemic containment policies. The idea behind the study is that we saw these sustained epidemic oscillations at many scales and in many regions of the country, of the globe, over also a long period of time. There were also studies at the time that said that they can pinpoint the necessary level, so the critical level of mobility, in which you can track, kind of well see the increase or decay in the epidemic. And so we wanted to address both things with a very simple model. So our model uses data, which gives us trips in the form residence, origin, destination. So we know the residents of these of the people who belong to the trips. And this induces this probability distribution, which will allow us to endow our agents, which we use 1 million of them, with a schedule. So by integrating this probability distribution, you can just sample the probability that a given area H is the residence. You can also give them a workplace. And the real new novelty of the model is introducing this parameter P, which is going to give them extra trips. So there's a trip probability P that at some points during the day will either make them rest at home with probability 1 minus P, or go to another place to have epidemic contacts. And they can be sampled from the trip distribution, just knowing if they're either setting off from work or from home. So for the disease, we choose a very simple SEIR model. As you know, susceptible S is that you can catch the disease. Exposed is you have been exposed to the disease and you're developing the infection. Infectious is you're infected and you're infectious, and then you finally recovered. And we use some transition rates which are inspired by the COVID pandemic, but we don't want them to be super precise in that model. We want a similar timescale. So to quantify mobility, we compute the radius of gyration. So this squared root average of the places relative to their homes. And if we do this for each agent, we'll obtain a distribution, and we can characterize the system mobility by taking the average. And we do this instead of using parameter P, because this is what you would find empirically and track empirically in other studies. It's just a convenient way. It's actually not a very harsh loss of information, because P and this parameter with the data distribution give this homogeneous line here. So it's basically 1-to-1. So for simulation, we introduce a seed of 100 infected. And then as we will be very near critical regions where the epidemic can fluctuate a lot, we're going to introduce the seeding to make it robust. But in order to know that our seeding is not the one maintaining the epidemics, and to know when the epidemic is going to finish, what we're going to do is that we're going to observe the cases generated, and if they if they are more than the seeding introduced, it means the epidemic is not over. We're in a region of the reproductive number is greater than 1. And if we see less cases with a given seeding introduced, then it means the epidemic is basically over. So as results, if we use a mass action principle to make contagion in these zones, and we choose a sensible parameter beta, we're going to obtain a diagram like this. This is basically running simulations, setting a P, so a mobility level, but then also setting an initial immunity. And this is going to tell us in which region. And this can also, when we are running other simulations that will evolve, more or less use it to track the critical mobility boundary. In this case, it's not a single level, as some studies were detecting. It's a boundary that evolves with simulation. We choose a 5% outbreak to characterize it, but we could choose another curve if we wanted to. So then what we have to do is model the interventions themselves. And so the goal of an intervention is we are here at minimum mobility, and we want to get to the maximum mobility with the least epidemiological impact as possible. That would be a good intervention. And so we try to reproduce the incidence threshold-based interventions, which are colloquially known as called as traffic lights, which basically the function is every TR time steps, we measure the 14-day cumulative incidence, and we aim to readjust the mobility according to this. We have seen this, for example, in Mexico, Semáforo COVID, in Spain as well, with seeing the 14-day incidence and classifying. And we choose a form like this. So minimal incidence, maximum mobility for discrete states, over 150, no mobility allowed, sites from the baseline. So this is going to lead us to situations like this. If we have short enough time intervals and you can adjust the mobility good enough, then the epidemic is completely controlled. This is done due to the very fast oscillations that we see in the mobility diagram, which actually managed to approximate when integrated this between the critical mobility and the 10% outbreak. And you can also see it here in this diagram, which is the same as here, how the trajectories are very close and they are approximating via these fast oscillations. But this is, although epidemiologically very good, societally maybe not so much. And so what we think could happen in the real case scenario is that the allowed changes between states occur much slowly and maybe with higher revision intervals. And this will make you, will drive the system into sustained oscillations, which is one of our goals with this study. And it can be explained and traced to the time that you are above this critical mobility boundary. And you can see also the system going into the, let's say, more outbreak dangerous zone much more often and for a prolonged amount of time. So now knowing that there's this boundary and that we can trace all of this impact and epidemiological efficiency to this boundary, then let's propose some interventions based on it. So let's say we have a good enough surveillance data and modeling to accurately estimate the critical mobility level. So every TR time steps, what we can do is, if our epidemic is going good enough, let's set our parameter allowed mobility to what we think is the critical mobility boundary. And if not, if things are going bad, then we just stay the same. But then can also be the case where we don't have good enough surveillance. And so what we can do here is try to do an approximation, because we know overshoots will eventually lead again to the boundary when immunity builds up. So the heuristic procedure goes as follows. Every TR time steps, if the epidemic is going well and the incidence we have seen a decrease in this time between the intervals, then we allow some mobility. If not, we stay the same. And this self-corrects the overshoots, as we'll see now. Again, this is with the model, which is the expected is that incidence is minimal. And also you're perfectly following the curve. This is by design, and it's a confirmation that this would be the optimal way. But our heuristic procedure actually manages to approximate very well. As you see here, it contains a bit more spiking, but more or less overall does not go into this danger zone at all and manages to follow the evolution, so the critical boundary, quite well. We use some performance difference to compare between them. So surplus incidence, all of this incidence above the 10 cases per 100,000. The peak, which is proxy for hospital saturation. Also, this erraticness relative to the ideal mobility. And also this effective mobility above the 10% line. So we integrate in the time window and we see how much mobility we have above. That's basically a proxy for sustained time periods in the dangerous outbreak zone. And we see what we have seen with the examples, just in a more general, so with more numbers behind to support it, is that you can get a very nice epidemic efficiency, but at the cost of mobility for the traffic lights. If not, you're going to get very bad epidemiological results. And for the mobility, we see, well, what is expected by design, which is they're following very well the critical mobility curve. They don't have a lot of erraticness. They don't go a lot into the danger zone. They have very good epidemiological impact. So under the assumptions of a model, we have been able to reproduce the mobility immunity phase diagram with the critical mobility level, which is one of the things we wanted from previous works to validate. We have hypothesized that the source of these incident waves is the delayed application of traffic light interventions when you couple them to the mobility of the epidemic. And we have also related the performance of the traffic light interventions to the other interventions and used the lessons learned just by knowing this critical mobility boundary to propose new interventions. So, of course, comparing the efficiency and performance of both. I'm going to drink a bit more water because if not. So the third chapter is network epidemiological model for contact tracing. The idea was to assess contact tracing. Contact tracing, what you want to do is you want to isolate individuals who are infectious. You know that they're infectious, they're confirmed, or potentially infectious because they have been in contact with someone who has been infectious. Non-digital contact tracing, this is when you had people researching contacts, calling, so making calls to workplaces, consume significant resources. The idea of digital tracing is, for example, to lower the investigative workload because you have the contacts recorded. You eliminate the recall bias because you don't have to remember with how many people I've seen myself in these 7 days. Alerts can be delivered in real time. And, you know, it was so promising that many apps were developed. We have seen Radar COVID, we have seen Immuni, we have seen TUS Anti-COVID, we have seen the NHS COVID-19, amongst many others. the thing is, when I started this study, there was no empirical evidence on the effectiveness of digital contact tracing, and the studies were very limited. So the idea was, as part of a COVID response plan in France, let's do a plausible estimate of the effectiveness of digital contact tracing. And very important to this estimate is how much we could actually get of the coverage of these apps, what is the role of age with the disease and the whole process, and what is the role of settings. So to do this, the model was built on top of a synthetic population. I won't go into many details. I'll just say that the main features of the population, so the data it used. We have a lot of details on municipalities, so workplaces, schools, universities, of course, the population size, the distribution of sizes of the workplaces. We also have school enrollment and labor force statistics, so we know how many people are working, how many people are studying. We know the age pyramid, how many people are commuting for work, how many people are commuting to study. Also, what is the household size distribution, but also what is the composition of households as well. So how many single parents, parents with more than one child, is it single child? So all of this, we had that information. And additionally, the smartphone penetration, so how many people have a smartphone in a given age gap, by another source, but of course very relevant for the study. So to do this, it was built the acquaintance network. This network is all the possible contacts that could happen. Maybe they do not happen every day. This is something that is addressed later, but this is, let's say, all the possible contacts that in theory could happen. The acquaintance networks consist of 5 layers, as you can see: household, workplace, school, community, and transport. And the household layer is basically full clicks, because you hopefully know everyone that lives with you. But in the other layers, we do have a random graph that also has a mean degree that varies with the setting and also with the size of this setting. Okay, in very small places, you'll be close to knowing everyone. In very big places, the number of contacts saturate. Okay, so we would obtain contact distribution like so. So much more contacts in work compared to the house. Also relatively in community, very little in transport. And as a side effect, which is kind of a validation of this network and of this synthetic population, we obtain a very nice age associativity matrix. So the second network, which is built on top of the other one, is the daily activation rate network. The idea is to endow some temporal dynamics. So we know more or less what is the frequency of contacts depending on layer, and this was done by questionnaires. And so the idea is now we're going to get the acquaintance network and we're going to give them an activation rate. And so by doing this, by sampling, we give them a temporal dynamic throughout the simulation. The disease, what is important to capture in the disease is the 2 subclinical and clinical routes. Subclinical can also more or less, you can say they are asymptomatic, so no milder symptoms, and also has effects on transmissibility, as we will see. I don't want to go into too many details, but I do want to highlight how age setting and the layer contributes to this transmission model. We see, for example, susceptibility depending on age. We see transmission risk depending by layer. The infectious stage, so subclinical, clinical, has an effect on transmissibility. And of course, depending on your age, it would be easier to go down the subclinical route. So asymptomatic, younger people more likely to be asymptomatic, and people of more age to have severe symptoms. Transmission just takes into account the contacts you have had and where you've had them, and you can compute them easily because it's agent-based. So this allows us to obtain a baseline of results, which is going to allow to compare the interventions afterwards. So we have a beta equal to 0.25, which leads us, for example, to R0 equals 3.1, although we explore many other transmissibility values because at the moment we didn't know which was the real transmissibility. And we get a sense, for example, where the cases happen, namely a lot of cases happening in working age adults, and also in household, workplace, and community prevalently. So now we go into the contact tracing. So the detection of an index case, in this case, this person here in the middle, is going to trigger this procedure. Household contacts are always traced because you know them. And then we assume that the others depend on the app. Traced individuals are isolated, which is a rigorous procedure in which you follow their clinical history and you try to confirm the infection. There's a few processes and delays happening. For example, there is a probability that you are confirmed, but you can also happen to not be confirmed if the testing is not very good, especially at the start. There's also a delay, a temporal delay into which this confirmation happens. This depends also on clinical and subclinical infections. We have a probability of compliances depending on household contacts or app. So if I get notified by the app, maybe I decide to ignore it. Then isolation, of course, has an effect on the possible contacts, but also the transmissibility inside the household. And there's a probability of dropping out. Isolation is kind of this big diagram, and I won't go into too many details right now, but the idea is that you are you're trying to confirm the infection and also tracking if the people are infected to not release them early. And so you go through this loop until they finally leave or they drop out because they are sick of it. So the main results are these figures here. We have chose these as baseline parameters, but we have also explored others. The idea is that this line represents healthcare saturation levels, and we see that only at very low transmissibilities and quite high app adoption, relatively high, of course, 32, you would manage to control the epidemic. But in any other situation in which transmissibility is higher, you would not be able to prevent hospital saturation, but you are still able, as you see in these diagrams, to save a lot of cases. For example, if you look at the attack rate, you can maybe save, in the worst case of highest transmissibility, you can save 7%. And then with full app adoption, you could save 20%. So it means that you are still preventing contacts. You're still preventing, even though you cannot completely have the epidemic under control, you're still preventing cases. And as well, as I said, you can see always a relative reduction from 20, 30 up to maybe 80 or so, depending, of course, on how strong the infection was. The good thing about this model, and the focus was, of course, setting. So where is the intervention going to be better? And that's why you build this model. But it's maybe a bit cumbersome to go through all the details, but the key takeaways are community shows very high tracing from the digital parts. Schools reasonably see a low detection because kids do not have, at least back in 2020, did not have so many smartphones. Household isolations address the school layers. So you see when you introduce this household isolation versus the baseline, we see very prominent rise. Then transmission in workplaces escape the household isolations, but they are finally addressed by the digital contact tracing. So digital contact tracing was very effective in the workplace. We can also get a sense for when, in which age groups this intervention is more effective. The idea is that in the baseline, working age adults are the ones that are mostly affected, as index cases, but also with the app. But also when introducing household interventions, you're going to see benefits for the youngest because the household is very prominent for the younger kids. But of course, for the oldest, because they don't have many of the other layers. And a very nice result of this is this last figure here. which shows the oldest also benefit from the app, even though they do not use it. And this is because if they are affecting the middle-aged adults, which are the primary contacts of the eldest, then you're breaking these chains of transmission, which is very nice. Even though they can't use the app, they are benefiting indirectly. We can also get a sense of how many people are isolated, unnecessarily isolated. So how many people went through the isolation process and they were actually not infected in the end. I won't go into too many details, but more or less the sense is that depending on transmissibility and app adoption, you can go from 4 to an average of 10 people that are traced and so isolated from the procedure. Okay. So as a summary, we have constructed this complex model with a lot of multi-layered factors to assess contact tracing and digital contact tracing. If you have high enough transmissibility, you are going to get a reduction in the peak. And the app does help because we see a 70% reduction in the peak. But it's only at moderate transmissibility that you're going to see really good benefits like a 90% peak incidence reduction. And the epidemic becomes manageable, meaning it's controlled, it's basically very low levels at 32% app adoption. So digital contact tracing complements the household isolation by targeting the infections at work. And although smartphone penetration is low among seniors, it confers indirect protection. And finally, we go to the micromobility model and simulator, MIMOS. The setting was Valladolid, who has 400,000 Vallisoletanos. And what they wanted to do is implement a low emission zone in the city center. This means that you're going to limit the vehicles that have a low emission standard. So the older vehicles, the more polluting vehicles. And they, of course, want to try and know what would be the impact of this. But even more interesting, you want to see the side impacts. So not only on the people directly in the zone, but also in the surroundings. For example, there can be an increase in parking demand at the borders because some cars will not be able to enter. So you want to park at the borders. There may be an increase in public transport demand. It may become more or less attractive to have less traffic. But of course, there's always the focus of the possibility of introducing transport inequality because low-income people have a worse emission standard logically than maybe other citizens. So a digital twin was considered to this, as I believe many of you know. Digital twin is a digital model of an intended or actual real-world physical system. And what we want to do is to build it so it can test alternative scenarios and counterfactuals. So besides the prediction of the impact, we may want to try other geometries for this zone. We may want to suggest alternative rules. So for example, what are the sanctions? What is the price for entering any other kind of rule that involves monetary exchange or time schedules or things like this? You also may want to plan the reinforcement of public transport to mitigate the negative impacts. And so to do this, as we did with the previous study, we part from a synthetic population, which has activity locations and points of interest, work, home, where they, if they're a student, so all of these details. But most importantly, and this is the difference with the last one, the synthetic population has also an agenda for the agents. This means that you have a sense in which places and at what time intervals there will be. And this is given because this comes from data, so questionnaires that they do to people on how they spend their time. But what we don't know is how they traverse and they do these things. And this is what the mobility model will try to address. To do this, we gathered a lot of data. As you can see, renting bikes, city buses, regional buses, trains, and then also we consider Palencia, which is at 30 minutes by car. So there's a lot of interconnected mobility. So we also included it. And all in all, we have for public transport 3,849 stops, and one itinerary per day of the year. If you want, you can take a different bus. So now we want to actually, with this data, coalesce it into a public transport network. So we go through a few steps. Generating the backbone, we want to join the information of the stops and do it so in a more or less accurate manner. And so we use the non-simplified networks from OpenStreetMaps to help us guide this. What we have is our stops. We then do a precise routing, so through the streets of how they would be joined. And then we don't need the spatial information. We just save the lengths, so the topological information, but not the spatial trajectories. And we have cross-checked with other routing services. So it's quite sensible doing it this way. Then we have to allow for transfers. What we suppose is that in a radius of 3 kilometers, you can have the transfers. And this is to prevent explosion in the degrees of the nodes. Then we again use the precise walking network to estimate this. We save the information. And then because rational agents like to do shenanigans in any way and capability you give them, we only allow for one transfer. So not these two, only to the closest stop, okay? And this is actually not such a hard imposition because one of the results that I really liked from this model is that they can actually bypass this restriction by doing, again, rational agent shenanigans. In this case, more sensible than the others that we try to prevent. We also want to give them some temporal dynamics. In this case, which buses are departing, at what times will they cross the stops, and this is so that agents can also take into account in their routing when the buses will go through the stops, so they know the waiting times and things like this. All in all, the public transport network has time, length, and all this temporal information. And via OpenStreetMaps, we can collect for the driving network and the cycling network all this other information. So time, length, number of lanes, capacity, priority, meaning who goes first at an intersection, velocity, the kind of highway that we're in. And in the case of the cycling network, we really only need the length and if it's a cycleway. So cycleway is you're not sharing the road with cars. So it's an element of comfort. So finally, I introduce the star of the model, which is doing coevolution. So the idea of coevolution is that you want agents to evolve according to their own self-benefit, whilst adapting their actions to the other agents and the environment. You're not imposing any general optimal way of doing this. You're allowing them to learn. So they're very adaptive, as I said, and you need to endow them with some sensible logic, and from there, the results are derived. So to do this, I did the pre-processing in Python, but I implemented the model in C++, and I will never do that again. So the iterative cycle goes as follows. We load some information, so networks, agent attributes, and agenda, some pre-computations. And then we go through this cycle, which will help and aid the learning of the agents. So first comes the routing. So routing is a process of proposing sensible ways of traversing the system, so each mode of transport. And we do this by maximizing utility. Maximizing utility is not minimizing time, so you have to take into account kind of the overall comfort of the transport, the travel times, the waiting times, if you have to pay any fees, and maybe if you traverse any distance. Like, for example, if you have to pay fuel, this scales with the distance, okay? And then to do this, and with a few constraints that allows us to do some tricks, we can do a modified Dijkstra algorithm, which will quite efficiently sample and propose these routes. Namely, it has some modifications because we wanted to have the temporal characteristics of the transport network in it. So you have to know every time you switch from one itinerary to the other, if there's waiting times, if there's things like this. But won't go into too much details aside from this. Then we need to help them choose. So choice can be done in the first iteration with a multi-logit model, so one route per mode. And then you can propose this transition probability to other modes with a Monte Carlo Markov chain. We only limit to one choice per mode because there are some modes, like for example cars, that suffer from combinatorial explosion of options. And if I were to allow all the possible options, then I would basically always be sampling car trajectories and not the other ones, okay? If I propose only one route and then one of the car routes gets ruled out, then I can still have the others in mind, and it works much better like so. Finally, we go into the simulation part. We have some assumptions for the simulation for the private transport. So when you're driving, we assume that you have to respect safety distance, the number of lanes, the road capacity, and also the road priority. And for the public transport, we really are only considering if there's space inside the buses. These modes at the moment are also decoupled. So if there's a traffic jam, the buses won't feel the traffic jam. And cycling is not simulated because the coupling can be considered even less with the others and between agents as well. So the public transport simulation, again, without too many details, but it has because it's event driven, it has a complex flow of information between the events. So when you exit from a location, you go to a transport stop, it can be saturated or not, or you can traverse it down, then you will have to unload, maybe you go to another transport. Also, maybe a transport is saturated and then you miss the transport, and the agent needs to know what to do if they miss the last possible transport. And so we have this kind of flow of events leading to other events. In the private transport simulation, what we are considering namely is these gap dynamics and safety distance, as I said, and priority. This would be roads of higher priority, this one. So it's trying to merge into a higher priority road. And here we see that this car is occupying this space. So this one has to wait. Also, to respect safety distance, this one has to wait because this one has just occupied that space and it's too close to get in. And at the same priority level, this applies, but this one has now reached before. And because they're at the same priority, because it's a square cross, it could now go in. And it doesn't look so complex as the other diagram, but it's much more complex because you have to take into account all the things that could happen. So saturation, how do I desaturate the system? When do the gaps open? What happens when I reach the end of the segment? I have to look forwards and backwards. I have to look forwards in time to know if I'm going to interrupt the trajectory of an incoming car. So it's a much more complicated process than it looks like. But finally, we reach the learning part. And this is the big part for these models, which is we're going to give the agents, each agent, by the way, so it's not a general memory, it's each agent has a personal memory system, a short memory where every iteration, they learn something new. Oh, I didn't foresee this. I'm taking too much time in this link or something like that. And so they record it. And then once they have finished the simulation, they integrate it with their long memory. And this long memory will help them plan and route the following iterations. It's basically like saying, you plan your trip at home with Google Maps, then you say, wow, this bus line really sucks. It was full of people. I took 5 minutes more than expected, and maybe next day you try another transport mean. So this is the idea behind the first iteration. They don't have any long memory yet, so they choose according to the general information. Then they will encounter maybe some huge delay in these links. They will update and they will change their route. And this learning can be done in various ways. I go into a lot of detail because it can be kind of a critical point for these models to do them right. But the idea is to use a reinforcement learning paradigm. And also at the start, forgetting. So at the K, because at the start, it's very erratic. Everyone wants to do the same routes. Maybe you see catastrophic things and you don't want them to have an everlasting impression of these things. And this is why you introduce a simulated annealing scheme as well here, where the reinforcement, the learning starts very slow and then increases, and the forgetting starts higher and then decreases, because you at some point want them to settle on an option. You don't want them to keep forgetting and keep learning, keep forgetting. So after doing this process, you will finally stabilize on the distribution of routes, and you will get, you can read the output. And so we arrive to what is the solution of these models. The solution of the model is not to optimize a global function, and it's not to find the best routes in general. It's more of a Nash-like equilibrium, which was famously described by John Wardrop in his first principle as the journey times in all routes actually used are equal and less than those that would be experienced by a single vehicle on any used route, which in 1952 is a way of saying no one really wants to change their option unilaterally. Okay, if I don't coordinate with other people, I wouldn't like to change. And so in our case, because we have these probabilities for each mode and route choice, this can be extended from a user equilibrium to a stochastic user equilibrium, but the idea is the same, is that the possible routes and the frequency in which you select them, they stay the same. So as results, and let's see if Google is so kind of loading this, highly pixelated, but these are a sample of some of the trajectories that agents have been learning throughout the simulation. So they have already been learning for a few iterations, and they know their preferred paths. If I drew all of them, maybe I would still be animating this figure, so only a few are shown. The idea, so the preliminary results for our case study was, let's give them, with this European manual of emissions, let's assign them an emission factor based on the average speed. And you can obtain the average speed because they can stop and start. So you know that more or less what would be the average speed. And we get a sense at the peak hours of which roads would have the highest congestion. In this case, the roads that channel traffic in the morning outside, they have much more emissions than the others. And well. So as a summary, we have seen how to approach policymaking regarding mobility. In this case, we chose the digital twin, and we chose the co-evolutionary agent-based model. How to gather and process data to set up the model. Understood the logic, hopefully. How to construct the model, so how to explore the route space, how to model the agent's choices, construct the simulators, incorporate a learning routine. We have seen some preliminary results, and now, if I'm not too badly, well, conclusions and outlook. So we have shown in general how agent-based models can be used for policy making in social systems that display complexity. We proposed in the first study future policies for AI agents to foster cooperation. We have examined the effects and disentangled how these protocols work. We have used two different methodologies to know that the results are robust. Then we have hypothesized future policies for epidemic control based on mobility. A traffic light intervention can induce sustained epidemic oscillations. We have demonstrated this under the assumptions of the model. We have proposed alternative interventions. The third study simulates a complex intervention in the COVID pandemic. We have seen the role of age setting and app adoption on transmission and clinical history. We have assessed the strengths and weaknesses of these interventions. Then we have seen the construction of the digital twin based on co-evolution, gathering data, as I said, constructing the loop and allowing agent choices, the simulators, and the learning mechanics. So all in all, final slide, I think, because this is 89. We have seen examples of the uses of agent-based modeling. We have seen bottom-up approaches to understand the mechanisms that drive these social interactions, epidemics, and mobility patterns. We have connected theoretical insight with empirical data to postulate, but also in some sort of way test the policies that can be deployed. We have contributed open source tools and frameworks like the MIMOS digital twin. And we have done an advancement of research in hybrid human AI populations by motivating future experiments or research projects like the one me and my friend Manu, there he is, Chaleco, that we want to continue this project. These are the publications stemming from the thesis. And thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Bueno, ella es del jurado, si quiere.
We give time for applause at the very end of the public examination. So the public presentation has finished, but the public examination will go. So now it's time if anyone wants to give the